Hello, everyone. You get to hear from me again so soon. I'm happy to start off the first panel session of the INC meeting, and it's called Trial Design and Execution. And this panel was put together by myself and my colleague, Dr. Jerry Baer at the FDA. We are both neonatologists. I stayed in academic medicine, and Dr. Baer went into regulatory science, but I think between the two of us, we're a very dynamic duo. So I'm happy to co-host this session this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So I'm going to start with about 10 minutes of background. We have an excellent panel of stakeholders that are all going to give insightful input, and then the hope is to have some time at the end to engage the audience and really have a robust discussion. So first we'll start with some disclosures. I'm an academic neonatologist in Kansas City, Missouri at Children's Mercy Hospital. I am a consultant for the MITRE Corporation, working with health IT experts to improve care of infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome. And Dr. Baer has the following disclosures: that the views are hers and do not reflect the views of the FDA, and that she's not here to discuss specific product development. So as most folks on this call are very familiar with, there's an incredible unmet need for treatment of many neonatal conditions. And we need to develop and share strategies among different stakeholder groups about how to more efficiently operationalize and complete neonatal trials. And part of this slide is not showing up, but this figure is the results of a search that Dr. Baer did on clinicaltrials.gov between 2010 and 2019 with the keyword neonate or newborn. And what you can see is that over this decade time frame, the number of clinical trials registered with neonates or newborns as the focus has increased in number. But unfortunately, many of these do not translate into drug labeling. And so the goal of this session today is really to have an in-depth discussion about how we can do better designing neonatal clinical trials, operationalizing neonatal clinical trials, and improving drug development. So we're going to start the session with an interactive session. And so you will see on your screen 2 poll questions that I would like you to answer. The first question is, are you personally aware of any neonatal study protocol that was developed with the input of NICU experienced parents? So please answer that question. And the second question is, are you aware of any neonatal study protocol that was developed with the input of NICU nurses? And I'm going to give everyone some time to answer these questions, and then the results will be displayed for all to see. That is correct. So for the question about NICU parents providing input to study protocol development, 16% of you answered yes, 57% answered no, and 26% answered not certain. For the question about NICU nurses being involved in study protocol development, 21% said yes, 48% said no, and 29% said not certain. So the majority of people have not had experience of parents or nurses being involved in protocol development. And that's one of the things that we're going to work these out. So this slide talks about one of the things the panel is going to discuss at length today, and that is what are the important considerations when we talk about neonatal study design. And one key thing that came up in our planning meetings was that sponsors need to really show flexibility in protocol requirements that fit with the complexity of neonatal clinical care. So one example is PK blood sampling or other study interventions that can be really onerous if they are not tailored to the neonatal population. And so, for example, if you have PK sampling times that are very rigid after the administration of a study drug, that can lead to more pokes for vulnerable infants and also more parents declining enrollment in the study because they know it will involve more pain. If there's flexibility in PK sampling times where you give generous windows, then it's much more likely that we can collect PK and other study blood samples with clinical pokes, and use population PK modeling to, accept that data set that's not as necessarily clean as a traditional PK data set, but there are definitely pharmacometric tools that can be used for that more uneven sampling type data. And another issue is that parent input at the design stage of study protocols. And this goes under the flexibility section because if you hear a parent's voice, if you really hear it, there's little doubt that there will need to be some modifications made to what the sponsor had originally planned. And this goes the same as having NICU nursing input at the design stage. So, making sure that as long as we all have the same goal of doing a valid study in this population, the more voices we can have early in the design stage and the more flexibility we can have for the neonatal population, the better the ultimate design will be. In addition, it's important to have flexibility in pharmacodynamic outcome measurements or clinical trial outcomes. So, for example, I'm the site PI for multiple neonatal studies sponsored by pharmaceutical industry, Pediatric Trials Network, NIH, and oftentimes the PD outcome or the study outcome will be collected as part of standard clinical care, but maybe not exactly at the time that the original sponsor had envisioned. And so having flexibility of how can we integrate this study protocol with standard neonatal care. Some of the other design considerations that have actually been supported by the progress made by the INC are really understanding optimal collection and reporting of adverse event data. We know that neonates, especially those that are hospitalized and more likely to be involved in clinical trials, have many unwanted clinical events throughout their hospitalization. And so instead of asking site study personnel to report every single thing that happens to a neonate every day that they're on the trial, it's important for the people who designed the study to understand the baseline risk of certain events in the neonatal population. In addition to tailoring exactly what adverse events are collected and what are meaningful, it's important to have a standard way to grade the severity of those events. And so the new tool, the NAESS, will take us a long way in that regard. And also, when we look at adverse events, the work that the INC is doing around population-specific values for vital sign changes and laboratory values will go a long way to help sponsors have a gold standard protocol for how to identify adverse events. And one of the things we'd like to discuss with the panel in the audience is, if you know that a typical preemie is very likely to have a clinical event multiple times in their hospitalization, is the benefit of reporting every time that event happens as an adverse event worth the additional stress that it puts on the local study team? So we'll discuss those things with the panel. As far as study execution considerations, one of the themes that came up in our discussion is informed consent documents. These documents can contain an overwhelming amount of information that really is pulled from prior studies of this drug in very different populations, geriatric populations, older adult populations. And if all of this data pulled from other populations is populated into the neonatal informed consent, it can be very overwhelming for parents to understand what is actually relevant to their child. So is there the possibility for sponsors to bring flexibility to different consent forms for different pediatric populations? And is there room for INC to advocate for small changes to the informed consent document, such as a summary page at the very front, which really focuses in on what's important for this population? In addition, parent involvement in developing consent form documents and making sure that the consent process is vetted with a group of NICU experienced parents, such as local parent advisory boards. So we have another polling question before we transition to our panel discussion. And this polling question that I would like you to answer is, are you aware of any consent forms that have been modified by a sponsor to be specific to the neonatal population? Please answer the poll question and then I will share the results. Okay, with about 2/3 of our audience answering, we have an even split between yes and no, around 38%, and 25% being not certain. And so actually, to me, that is excellent news that we have cases of informed consent being modified for the neonatal population. So now we're going to transition from the introduction to my co-moderator, Dr. Jerry Baer from the FDA. She is going to introduce the panelists, moderate their discussions, and then audience questions. So thank you for your attention so far.
All right. Thank you so much, Tamara. And to everyone for these fantastic introductions. As we all are, I am also trying to figure out how to use this platform. So I will advance the slides. Okay, so we have an unbelievable panel of different stakeholders from different parts of the country and all different viewpoints on how to make trial design and trial execution more efficient and more effective for the neonatal population. And so someone forwarding the slides. I will first introduce Sandy Bowman, who will speak about the nurse's role in neonatal research.
Thank you, Jerry. And I'm honored to be invited to be a part of this panel with the Inc. I am a neonatal nurse, clinical nurse specialist, and work in research with the University of New Mexico and okay, great, thank you. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about the nursing role in neonatal research, and Tamara mentioned several things that I'm going to just touch on a little bit here, that involving nurses early in the development of a protocol is very important for a number of reasons. I've had the privilege of being involved early in several multi-site trials, and just having the input of a nurse to ensure that it's acceptable to nurses and families. And by that, I mean, just in reference to what Tamara was saying, that blood draws, that's not an extra burden on the infant. As many of you in the audience know, neonatal nurses are very protective of their patients, and we'll look at that as whether they support the research or not, and therefore may influence families' decisions to be a part of it or to continue in the research. So we want to make sure that those things are necessary and that nurses understand why those things are being done as well further down the line. Also, if the data is available, or is this something that nurses are going to have to take on as an added burden to record, that then impacts the reliability of that data as well. Nurses can aid in writing consents, especially consents in plain language at appropriate reading levels that we need for these studies. They can summarize the study but still maintain the key messages. And oftentimes those consent forms can get so long that parents will read the first few pages and then kind of tire out. So nurses can help to really get the key messages in there so that the communication can happen with the families. And also the clear understanding of the nurses that are involved in the study or going to be involved in the study helps on explanation and influence on family. Our group has shared some examples, and I have seen some myself, of where the nurse's belief in the study either influences the family to be a part of it, or their doubt of the study and the advantages of the study can also influence the family. Also, I'd like to make a plug for nurses as research coordinators. Nurses are very process and detail oriented, and especially neonatal nurses, and they already have the clinical knowledge. So when we talk about gathering the information about identifying adverse events, the nurses are more in tune with what is a usual finding in the neonatal population and may not be a significant adverse event, but rather something that is expected, and would have the knowledge to help evaluate those things as to whether they should be reported. And then in general, once the study is rolled out, involving the nurses at the bedside is also advantageous. Education about what the research study is about. We've talked a lot about identifying adverse events and being more accurate with the reporting of that. And I'll just share a quick example of something we've done recently with one of our studies, where we have posted the adverse events in a nursing communication order in the infant's chart that's enrolled in the study, so that nurses are aware that those are the things that we're really interested in collecting and reporting. And so nurses can help us to get that information, not only reporting it, but also recording it accurately in the medical record. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker. I'll be available for questions when we get to that question and answer period. But our next speaker on the panel is Jennifer Daigle. And she is speaking for moms and babies and is a parent. So Jennifer, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I just want to make sure I am on your screen. I'm also learning this for the first time. Okay. I just want to thank the INC for having me as part of this discussion as a NICU parent. It's really important that they are including the parent perspective in all of their work, and it is very much appreciated. So some of the things that I'm going to mention have been touched on earlier in this presentation, but coming from the parent perspective, I think it's still important to be said again. So for design challenges, from the NICU parent perspectives, the parents should be included in the child design very early on. And I believe, without seeing it up on my screen, that I think only 16% of the respondents to the survey earlier said that was the case. So that would be something critical to consider, is putting the parents in the room when the design process is happening, or at the very least asking them to read it over and make sure that it is something that is understood and the parents would be more perceptive and agreeable to consenting to. The parents should be included in the conversations regarding the outcome measures as well. Sometimes a parent's perspective and what they consider to be an adverse event themselves may be a bit different. And the parents are the primary caregivers, certainly post-discharge, but also in the NICU. And they should be able to share some opinions on what they think is an adverse event or a clinically meaningful outcome. Parent observations should be considered important and included in the data collected on the babies during the trial. I know some trials are doing that, and I think it's important to include what the parent sees. The parents are with them, most of the time, as much as they can be during the NICU stay, and they would be the ones to notice if the baby's skin color is changing, more rapidly, or if their behavior is changing, and if they're feeding more or less. So those are things that should be asked of parents and be included in the data collection if possible. The procedures for continued communication between parents and researchers throughout the life of the trial should be included in the design. Very often parents will come to me and say that they were unclear, that they could ask questions throughout the trial. They were unclear if they would be receiving the results of the trial once the trial has concluded. They were also unclear oftentimes if and how they could actually remove their child from a trial if they wanted to, or who to even talk to about that. So those are things that should be made very clear in the design of the trial, or the different ways to communicate with parents. And the last thing I want to mention about that is that a lot of times the parents, if they feel that they are their input is being included and that they will receive results after, it just really adds to their, their opinion of how important they are to their child's care overall. So the execution challenges from a parent perspective. Can we go back? Thank you. Consent timing. This can be a very sticky subject for sure. The antenatal approach would obviously be the best, if possible, if a parent was scheduled for an early delivery and is not experiencing anything traumatic at the moment. That would be probably the best time to have a conversation to ask for consent, or at least to explain the process of a trial to that parent. Of course, that's not always possible, but if it is, that would be the ideal moment to speak to a parent. Of course, even if the baby is already diagnosed with something that is critical that child would be looking at, and the parents know ahead of time, I think the earlier the better is what most parents say, as long as they are in the correct state of mind and not experiencing trauma at that moment. Antenatal, of course, would, I guess for lack of a better word, the consent would be fruitless if the mother does end up going full term, which is, of course, what everybody wants. But still, I think the opportunity to ask ahead of time would be the best. The postnatal approaches are challenging. What's really important to a lot of parents that I've spoken to and comes up quite often is sometimes they feel that the approach, or the person making the approach, is a bit tone deaf to what is going on in that moment. And it is certainly in the best interest of the parent and the baby, and the child, if the parents are approached during a time that is a bit calmer, not surrounding any very traumatic news or any really traumatic event. For example, being told their baby has to have surgery, immediately, or the baby just coming out of surgery, or being given some bad news. So it's kind of important to remember is to really kind of take a look around what's going on and take the time to approach at the right time. Those making those postnatal consent approaches to the parents of critically ill and premature babies might want to consider bringing along a social worker if possible. So, having experienced this myself as a mom of a micro preemie, you're not thinking clearly most of the time. Very often you're recovering from something medical yourself that led you to that situation of delivering that baby, prematurely or, critically ill. So having a social worker, tagging along for that conversation and being available to that parent would be a very good idea if possible. And if it's not, bringing the NICU nurse along, or making sure that baby's primary nurse, if they have one, or a nurse that's going to be often there, making sure that nurse is there when you're asking for consent can be very comforting to the parent. And I think Sandy had mentioned this a moment ago. it's really important that they feel comfortable. And if they've already gotten to know the nurse, even just for a few days, they'll be more likely to ask questions. And then the nurse will be there to explain anything that they may be misunderstood. And also keeping the lines of communication open is important to make sure that when you're asking for consent, that you do let the parent know they are always welcome to ask questions. They're always welcome to reach out and give them the contact person in which they can speak to, or who they should, as far as the line of contact goes, who they should contact if they have any questions. And the last piece of advice, and I get this from parents often also, is it would be best if you could explain the trial but not ask for consent in the same conversation. If you could give the parent some time to digest what they've learned and even formulate questions or do their own research before they have to give you an answer. Okay, next slide. So involving parents, I've been asked several times, where are the parents that can be involved in study design and execution? Where can we find them? And of course, you don't want to involve a parent who's in the middle of their NICU stay. So, and it was also mentioned earlier, many hospitals have parent advisory councils or patient and family advisory councils. Yet often these councils don't include NICU parents. Sometimes they do, but not very often. So maybe seek out some NICU graduate parents that are maybe 1 or 2 years past. I'm sure some of your nurses have kept in touch with some of the parents, or that maybe there's been NICU reunions, and those are the parents that you want to reach out to, and they would be the best ones to get involved with a clear head and a little bit past their own particular situation, and they can advise on the procedures and protocols as far as the design goes, and of course the consent and execution. I would also like to throw out the idea of considering paid positions for NICU parent advisory positions. Some hospitals do have that, many don't. And if that's something that's possible, even just for a part-time position for a parent, I truly believe that the entire NICU itself will be better off if there's a parent advisor who is available for consultations, for meetings, and of course to sit in on discussions on trial implementation and design. The other thing that I've heard from some parents often is they don't have the time, or they're not able to participate in the trials. If their particular observations are required and they can't be there very often, or if there's a trial that is extending past the baby's discharge, they maybe can't afford it, or they don't have the time for that. So it might be worth it to consider compensating parents in some way. And it's not that you're paying them, to, work on their baby or test their baby. It wouldn't be perceived that way. The parents feel often that their input is important, and they just simply can't make the time or afford the opportunity to participate. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. And up next, I'm going to introduce Barry Mangum from Pedion. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I hope that everyone can hear me and see me. Like many, we're trying to do this virtually these days. I want to thank Jerry and Tamara for inviting me to be a part of this, as well as the INC. I have been in the field of neonatal clinical pharmacology for almost 40 years, and I think hopefully I can give you some insight on what we do at Pedion Research as the only dedicated pediatric clinical research organization. This is the type of patient that we typically see in a clinical trial. This is a 750-gram, 28-week gestation baby, and it's one that I have a great desire to help, because there, as we've already indicated, there are a number of compounds that have not been tested in these children, as we all well know, and that we also know that there are disease states that we're learning more and more about, for instance, HIE or ROP or BPD, those types of examples of diseases. So I'm going to be very brief in my conversation today. I think that in the protocol design space, I'm really looking here at more of the operational components of designing and creating a program for developing a drug in the neonatal space. And one of the things I would like to leave the audience with is we need to be proactive in the protocol design space. So whether it's a randomized placebo-controlled trial or an open label PK trial, all of these things, or if it's a single ascending dose trial, all of these things can be done in the neonatal patient population. Matter of fact, we're doing those now, but we have to be very careful and very prudent about design of the protocol. And when I say that, some of these protocols that we're working on here of late take anywhere from 1 to 2 years to get completely designed and through the regulatory authorities. So being a proactive advocate of the protocol design, we interject ourselves early in all of our work that we do, and that's a great thing. But it also brings some level of frustration to our pharmaceutical sponsors because we want to make it pediatric and certainly neonatal friendly. The other thing I'd like to leave you with is begin with the end in mind. What are we really trying to achieve with the specific compound or asset that we're dealing with here for the treatment of the disease state that we're working on? And so if you begin with that end in mind, then you can back extrapolate into what the protocol should be for the primary and secondary endpoints, inclusion, exclusion criteria, and so forth. But that's a very vital thing. You've got to look at where we're going at the end of the day and what the final study report might look like, as well as the data, because when it's all said and done, it's all about the data for getting a drug approved, but it's also all about the care of this child. And we always put children in the forefront of what we do every day. Factor into the protocol parental concerns, and you've heard Jennifer express this already, and what the burden on the family might be. Many of the studies that we look at in neonatology, or some of them, actually have long-term safety follow-up or neurodevelopmental follow-up and those types of things. Some of this can be done not necessarily at the clinic or in a neonatal intensive care unit space, but some of the long-term follow-up safety issues can be done at home. And we're beginning to see a pivot now in how we do clinical research in the United States and around the world to more of a virtual component for this outpatient part of the study. So you might want to consider having home health care involved in this particular case. And in that situation, you'd want neonatal trained home health care individuals to be at the bedside, right at the home side for that child. You also need to factor in the standard of practice in the neonatal environment. I know many of the trials that I've worked on over the years don't take this into consideration. And every neonatal intensive care unit has a little bit of a different way of doing clinical trials or their practice in their NICU. And so look at that when you're doing your site initiation visits or you're planning your clinical trial. One of the things that's very, very vital is look at what that standard of practice is in that space and then adjusting to that. There's nothing worse than walking in a neonatal intensive care unit as a CRO or anybody else, and you have a monitor going in to interact with the coordinator, and the monitor says, show me your examining room. Well, obviously in a neonatal intensive care unit, we don't have an examining room. The NICU is the examining room, and it's where that child is cared for. So we need to be careful at what we do and how we do it and who we send to those units to work in that environment. Another thing is be aware of the NICU staff burden when building an electronic case report form. And I know that Jonathan Davies had a lot of comments about a current trial that's ongoing right now. And we too are very keen to understanding what should and should not go into the ECRF. What data points are vital for us to collect and make sure that we are doing a really good job of getting a streamlined approach. Again, it speaks back to the time it takes to design these trials and getting them where we need them to be to take the burden off the family and to take the burden off the staff in neonatal intensive care unit. We need to factor in meaningful safety assessments, not creating more paperwork. We see this quite a bit. As a matter of fact, many years ago, we started working more aggressively in the neonatal intensive care unit, trying to develop some compounds there. What we found is that the paperwork, in this case, was much bigger than the child itself. And so many of the principal investigators decline working in this space. And the last thing we want to do at any of this point is discourage the future generation of principal investigators, young investigators, to get involved in this arena of neonatal intensive care unit research, because this is vital for the field. It's vital for getting compounds approved in children, specifically these neonatal patients. One of the other things that we've picked up on, and I think that INC is definitely working in this direction, is the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Authorities, the MEDRA coding terms. These coding terms, in many instances, were designed and developed for adult patients, and certainly not the neonatal intensive care unit. So we have tried to cull that down and looking at and designing that in a proactive manner, looking at the MEDRA coding terms before we even get started in a program. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with is embrace the thought that we think different, because when we walk into a neonatal intensive care unit, that's a very protected space. It's one where the nurses definitely are protected, as you already heard. And also, it's a space that we should look at as a totally different environment for research. Although it is, in my world, is a passion to do this type work, but it's certainly a place that we have to be creative and innovative and maybe a little disruptive in how we do our clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to stop. Certainly, there's going to be many questions at the end of this presentation for discussion, and I'm going to pass it over to our next speaker, Dr. Zimmerman from Duke University, who will be presenting her program.
Barry, thank you so much. I think beginning with the end in mind and think different are probably the two takeaways from my presentation as well. So I'll keep it very brief. I'm the chair of the Pediatric Trials Network Steering Committee and a physician at Duke University. We focus very much on therapeutics, but I think Tamara talked also about some of the things that have been very central to our success in the Pediatric Trials Network. So I'd just like to talk some about opportunistic sampling and data collection. Others have talked already about how many things are happening in the NICU already and how we just really need to be very thoughtful about burden for families, the clinical team and the study team, and making sure everyone's on board. So study methods that are going to leverage routine care have a lot of advantages in decreasing these burdens. Some of the things that you can think about are opportunistic sampling if you're doing a PK study, which means that you are being flexible in the timing of these the windows that you are collecting PK samples. It also means that perhaps you are taking advantage of drugs that kids are already potentially getting. And using that information, you can collect a few samples from a large number of kiddos who are getting these drugs and use pharmacokinetic modeling in order to make sure that you're doing, that you're able to get population PK results that can give you good answers about what dosing should actually be in this particular population. So I think just reiterating what Barry said about just being very creative in this space and thinking outside the box is where these types of opportunistic sampling and data collection type of situations can be very, very helpful. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Baer for the panel.
Thank you so much, Kanisha. I think we're going to have the whole panel. Can everyone hear me? I think we're going to have the whole panel up on the screen shortly. And all right. And so we don't have a lot of time. I think we're going to take 10 minutes for this panel, and then we'll just push everything else forward by about 5 minutes. And we have several really interesting questions. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to throw out the general topics, and each panelist can take another minute or two. Well, so we'll have about 10 minutes for the panel. So everyone can take about 2 minutes and answer whichever of the questions they would like. Does that work okay for everyone? So the questions are around, we have one question about the copious amount of information and challenging language that sometimes is in the informed consent. So we have to make sure that the informed consents meet a certain literacy level and that they're not complicated. The next question was, actually there's two questions similar to this. How can sponsors or investigators recruit parents or nurses or members of the community? How do you operationalize getting this kind of input for a study protocol? And then the third question is about long-term effect studies. Can you get permission, or do you have to get permission to go back later on to the study participants to get additional outcomes information? So those are the questions that we were asked. And I think, does anyone particularly want to go first in answering one or more of those briefly? Okay, Jen looks like she's ready. Thank you, Jennifer.
I just want to suggest the NICU Parent Network is an organization of all NICU parents that either run their own organizations that are smaller nonprofits or write books. And that whole organization is full of parents who are happy to participate. And we do partner with many other groups like NANT and NAN and some other organizations to provide the parent perspective. So if you're looking for parents and you can't find one in your direct hospital, NICU Parent Network is a great place to start.
Thank you, Jen. Does anyone else want to? Oh, Sandy. Hi, Sandy. Thanks.
Hi. I can address the question about the long-term follow-up. Most of our studies have long-term follow-up planned. And even in those studies where we don't plan that, we have just one extra question on the consent form if it's okay to contact them for future research. And so they check that yes or no and initial it or sign it, depending on the consent form. And we can go back to them. We have one study that now the kids are 16 years old and we're planning to go back. So hopefully we can find them.
So Jerry, this is Barry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Sandy hit the nail on the head. If you plan ahead and you put this in your consent form proactively, you can then continue to look at those children long term. One of the things that we're finding that everyone wants to look at is a Bailey's at 1 and 2 year, and even longer for that matter. Because if you look at that data, neurodevelopment is a very important function in the neonatal environment because we're giving drugs that may affect the long-term neurodevelopment and growth of that brain. So we want to assess that. And so that would be Sandy's got it right. You can put it in the consent form and carry it forward.
Jerry, I'm happy to certainly comment on how do you make this, the ICF a little bit more readable. And I think that involves exactly what Jen has talked about. Make sure you involve other people. Make sure that you're asking parents to read this and go over it and make sure that they can understand what you're talking about before you put it out in mass distribution.
Right. It seems very simple, but it sounds like it's not always done. Carl, I would really like to, Barry, I would really like to know more about home and virtual assessment of long-term outcomes, because this is one of the challenges we hear most often from investigators and sponsors. As a regulatory agency, we have this fine balance because we want to make sure that the products that get approved and the studies that are being done are addressing the questions of long-term outcomes for neonates. And at the same time, we don't want to make things overly burdensome so that they don't get done at all. So I'm curious as to if you can talk about any of the efforts that you're aware of on virtual long-term outcomes or home visiting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jerry. This is due to COVID, the world has changed. And so now we have a situation that parents don't want to bring children back to the clinic to expose them to other individuals and vice versa. So what we have done in our organization, like many other organizations, have gone to a virtual platform where we can actually, there are tools that have been developed specifically for this, and I won't be a spokesperson for those tools, but what I will say is that we use a lot of telemedicine to do this, and we use something like Google Glasses to actually analyze or look at that patient while we're evaluating them. And so then the physician who's on the other end of the telemedicine video, if you will, it's real time, they can actually see what the nurse is seeing at the bedside or at the home. And so we do this in a lot of our growth studies. So we can do amplitudometric measurements, we can do weight, we can do length, we can do all these things, and we can do it all remotely. In the neonatal environment, that I don't believe has been done yet, but I can see that some of the long-term safety follow-up spaces where we're looking for a certain marker, we can do that. And we can do blood sampling that way, we can do other sampling that way. We've done it and we're doing it now. And quite honestly, until we get a handle on COVID, I don't think we're going to see much change in that. I mean, it's going to get more virtual, and a lot of the programs across all pediatrics is going to be virtual.
Does anyone on the panel know, this is my own personal question, sorry, I'm taking a little indulgent moment here, whether there are apps being developed or electronic assessments that kids can do at home, or that parents rather can do with their children at home to assess, social, behavioral, cognitive testing?
Jerry, I don't know of any tools that have been developed for that, but I have been involved in the cognitive assessment of many children for a variety of different disease states. I don't think there's a real standard that's out there, whether it's the Connor assessment or whether it's some other type of assessment that's been validated. It's the validation of those tools that's really critical and important to you, the regulator, and to the EMA when a drug, you want to get it approved. So what I would suggest is that if we have tools like that, we need to certainly vet those with the regulatory agency before, in a proactive manner, in a pre-IND or in some communication with the regulators, so that everyone's on the same page when we go to the final study report and file that to the regulatory agency for approval of a compound in the neonatal intensive care unit.
Thank you, Barry. And I think Tamara is going to wrap us up.
Sure. So I'll answer one other question, and then we'll move on to the second panel. One of the questions asked about NICU parent orientation, and are we missing an opportunity to introduce the concept of clinical research during early parent interactions on NICU admission. And I'll give my personal experience at Children's Mercy Hospital. We have an 85-bed level 4 NICU, and I worked closely with our research coordinators to get a whole research section added to the NICU orientation process. So when parents within a few days of admission hear about, how to store their breast milk, how to interact with their baby, they also see a whole module on the academic mission of the Children's Hospital and the fact that they will undoubtedly be approached for clinical trials. So I think that is possible and an important step.
Perfect. Well, I think we are going to switch over to the second half of our panel. Thank you so much to Barry, Jennifer, Sandra, and Kanisha for joining us for this. So we're going to start. At the moment, we're missing one of our panelists, but I'm sure we'll find him. So we're going to start with Hiroko Iwami, who is joining us from Osaka City General Hospital.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for your introduction. It's an honor to be part of it. I think there is some cultural differences. So first, I'd like to talk about the current state of clinical trials in Japan. Oops. Okay. Sorry. So we require new trials specifically for the Japanese population, even if the drug is approved with successful evidence in other countries. As a researcher or medical doctor, although I've never personally been involved with a clinical trial for a new drug, we have lots of documents to fill out in order to conduct trials. It's really a complicated process, even though there are specialists to help us. Because of those issues, it really takes a long time to be approved. On the other hand, there would be great benefit to conducting trials in Japan. When we focus on the neonatal field, we have quite good outcomes regarding mortality and major adverse outcomes like IPH and NAC. The graph shows survival rates for infants born to each gestational age between 24 to 29 weeks. Japan Neonatal Research Network shows good survival rates overall. It would be beneficial to have clinical trials in Japan to see the effectiveness of drugs, since we can minimize unrelated adverse outcomes. One issue I'd like to discuss is recruitment. It is usually hard to recruit participants, especially neonates, for clinical trials. From the parent perspective, they are not familiar with clinical trials, so most of them show less voluntary interest in Japan. They also have negative image of clinical trials and mentally associate them with unethical human experimentation. The major issue is that they are really concerned about safety, especially since the target population is infants who cannot describe their symptoms by themselves. I agree the project of IMC safety working group is really important. However, once parents do decide to participate in trial, usually they are reliable and follow instructions pretty well. From the medical professional perspective, I don't think we have enough overall knowledge of clinical trials, including physicians working at hospital. We don't have enough time to obtain consent because clinicians are usually dealing with critically ill infants requiring acute intensive care in the NICU. It is hard to find appropriate timing to obtain consent when parents are upset because their baby is critical condition. And also there is a lot of paperwork to be done. Because of all those factors, medical professionals tend to regard clinical trials as a time-consuming job. However, like parents in Japan, once they're involved and decide to be part of it, they work quite hard to complete the trial. To resolve all those issues I mentioned, I think education for both parents and medical professionals is key. For parents, my solution is just a fundamental one. We just explain the detail of the background, purpose, safety, and method repeatedly to make them understand well. Maybe notice board and brochure would also work well. I'm not sure how many parents actually read it, but in the hospital, we introduce trials and progress on the hospital website. For medical professionals especially should all have a basic knowledge of clinical trials. Maybe military training is effective, but it is important that such training module be engaging and attract interest. We take some monthly e-learning from clinical trials every year, but it's actually boring to take. I think we should inform all staff about which trials are currently running at what stage in our unit. Usually physicians are informed, but not all nurses in many cases. It would be most important to have some role or duty in trials. Once we are involved in some part of the trials, we learn a lot and are forced to acquire knowledge. I think this is the most effective way to learn. Thank you for listening. So next speaker is Dr. Victoria Nicholas from Takeda.
Good morning and thank you. So I'm going to actually follow on what Dr. Awami mentioned with regard to the challenges and opportunities that are present in consenting for near-birth clinical trials. So we know that time is of the essence during the performance of life-saving procedures and interventions following birth or hospitalization of critically ill infants. And hence the tactics to enrich subject enrollment in near-birth clinical trials are also challenging. And particular interventions that target this transitional physiology require that study interventions must occur anywhere from minutes to hours after birth. But there's high stress associated with unexpected pregnancy outcomes, and the short time interval for enrollment in near-birth clinical trials often negatively impact supportive consenting practices, increasing consenting failures, the potential to alter clinical trial outcomes, or even lead to study termination, and the failure to advance drug development in these infant populations with very high unmet medical needs. And although recruitment in near-birth clinical trials is challenging, this period is a rich platform for drug development, and the opportunity to advance care and improve outcomes from the earliest time after birth is simply tremendous. In general, families recognize the value and necessity for clinical research in advancing care. And I think particularly during the global pandemic, it is quite evident that clinical trials are important in developing new medicines for previously unmet needs. This, along with the strong and widely held understanding that participation in clinical trials is based on the decision to give or decline consent, the standard consenting process has significant gaps. But research among families demonstrates that they are apt to decline consent when they feel time pressure, or to make negative decisions when they feel that they're approached during a difficult time. In fact, in recall surveys, many state that they would likely reverse a decision had they not felt the time pressure to consent, were better informed, or more aligned with the study team. Parent-centered approaches include the opportunity for antenatal engagement to fully leverage the beginning of the mother's admission to the hospital and the infant's delivery and admission to the NICU. This is obviously a period that could stretch from hours to days, therefore reducing the time pressure, but importantly allowing for iterative or longitudinal conversations that are timed with periods of calm, thereby lowering stress and permitting better alignment between the family, the study team, and importantly, building trust. So antenatal consenting approaches also allow for study support materials whose content could span the scope of disease awareness, present a study timeline and checklist, offer a what to expect materials, which is also an interesting way to bridge standard neonatal practice to the ongoing clinical trial, and even provide examples of frequently asked questions and answers, which may certainly empower the family's conversation with the study personnel. And of course, as has been mentioned in the previous panel, allow additional time for the review of informed consent documents, which are often complex. So study materials could also easily be provided in a digital format, allowing not only portability, but the use of video and voiceover to create engaging and interactive content, expanding the opportunity for understanding across a variety of learning styles. It is no doubt that advancing the standard of neonatal care in medicine is dependent upon successful execution of clinical trials and family engagement, such that the evaluation of important interventions across the perinatal and neonatal transition are possible. Approaching families during the antenatal period naturally expands the time window and significantly enhances opportunities for ethical consenting practice and supporting enrollment in near-birth clinical trials. And I will now hand the podium to Gary Knoll. Thank you.
So you can hear me, right? I'm not muted.
We can hear you.
I think the last speaker in this session before we do a Q&A, and I'd like to focus my comments specifically on registrational clinical trials and underscore that while we are now expanding, I think, the number of trials we're doing in the neonatal intensive care unit, it's worthwhile building on the experience that colleagues have had in conducting clinical research with the goal of registering new products for patients who are in the intensive care unit, as well as what we've learned over the last several decades in engaging children and getting children more involved in some of the registrational clinical trials in a more efficient and effective manner. Registrational trials, ultimate goal is to get a drug approved by regulatory authorities, get them labeled, and get those products available for use in children. And that process starts with a sponsor, typically, who's identified an idea and begins to develop a target product profile. And the message that I think is consistent throughout registrational clinical work that's the most efficient is engaging all of the stakeholders that are involved in the process. And not to be redundant, but it's important to repeat this as much as we possibly can in thinking this through, that parents, care providers, the regulators who would be involved in reviewing the data that's being generated, as well as the sponsors and the different aspects of those sponsors, the clinicians, the operations people, the commercial interests, all need to be considered stakeholders in the process, and they should be engaged at the earliest possible stages. And for most sponsors, in my experience, there has been some reluctance in engaging all stakeholders at the earliest process, recognizing that there's a lot of voices and there's a lot of different opinions that need to come through. And the impression is that that in some way slows the process down. I think the overall experience has been that without that engagement, you run great risk of complicating the design of your trial, putting together a feasible program, and ultimately getting a product registered for use and clinically available to our patients. Then progressing from the earliest possible stages in discussing the target product profile, what the medical need is, where it's going to fit in clinical practice. As previous speakers have mentioned, it's very important in designing these trials to align these trials as best we can with the routine care that's provided in intensive care unit, understanding that the intensive care unit has not only the urgency that's involved and the seriousness of the illness that's involved in these care, but also the flow of work that needs to be conducted in intensive care units, the nursing staff, the physician staff that's delivering care minute to minute for these children need to be taken into consideration in designing these trials. And it's only with the input from these individuals will we be able to design those trials that can most efficiently and effectively be executed. Related to that is designing trials that minimize the burden, not only to the patients and the families that are engaged in this trial, but also to the nursing staff and the physicians and others who are going to be involved in operationalizing the trial. And then the last thing I'd like to make a point of is the importance in executing this trial of sharing information all along the path of generating the clinical trial, of keeping in mind that practice in the intensive care unit does change quickly, and there will be on many occasions a need to amend protocols. By sharing information, you allow those changes and amendments to be understood by all stakeholders. But also upon completion of the trial, I think it's increasingly important to ensure that all stakeholders, not just the regulators and the sponsors, see that information that's been generated and understand what the outcome of that clinical work would be or has been. So I'll stop there, and I think I turn this back to, is it Jerry, who will lead the Q&A period?
I think I still also have to make my presentations. Oh. That's no problem. You could explain it as my flight was somewhat delayed, something like that. But anyhow, I made it, be it on another time moment. And what I would like to comment or make you think about a little bit is related actually to some of the comments which have been provided by the former speakers, and it's more rather a technique than an approach, and it's the concept of e-consent. In general, we all agree, I assume, that informed consent is one of the key elements of biomedical research, as it should provide meaningful information to potential participants to result in well-informed decisions. Oh, this go by itself. Previous. But we all know that informed consent should not be considered as getting a signature and job done. So the signature matters, but actually we need some more guidance on how this should be done. And I think that consent may be one of the approaches that can improve the setting. And the good news is that there's already some guidance from FDA on how to use or how to consider these electronic informed consents, defined as any electronic system which may incorporate multimedia in order to convey information and obtain informed consent. As former speakers also alluded to, it's nice to have video, it has to have supported information, but you need a structure to really get things done. And e-consent indeed is one of the major progress that can be made in this field related to presentation of information, how to use electronic signatures, because it still matters, obviously, identity verification, but also facilitate FDA inspections and facilitate review processes by ethical commissions or IRB boards, depending on what part of the world you're in. So, and the link provided actually refers to this Q&A guidance document as made by FDA. And actually this slide nice to illustrate what we mean with that. I have given you some slides with a lot of words, but it could be that actually this slide is better illustrating what e-consent is all about. It's about the structured approach, providing information, interactive if possible, multimedia if possible, to improve understanding, so that it is not about what the parents decide on, but it's also important that that you do have a good consent and a system where you can actually improve the knowledge, verify the knowledge, and actually also provide the parents with additional information depending on where they are in the process to learn through the study what the study is all about. So in this way, the format is an issue. It has an important impact on understanding, acceptability, security and trust, legal validity and usability, or issues, storage and content. And actually the nice thing is that a few weeks ago, there has been a systematic review on this topic, be it that unfortunately neonates were again almost excluded in this type of study. So there's some work to be done. I've done a scanned review and only found some information using secondary use, for instance, of blood samples collected in babies for neonatal screening purposes and subsequent secondary use. But I think e-consent may actually be one of the tools that we may consider to make the wishes of my former speakers feasible. Thank you. And I give the word back to Gary.
All right. Well, I think that was meant to be Jerry, or it could be Gary. We have Jerry, Gary, and Barry all on this session. So,
sorry.
Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists, and I think the team is going to bring them up so that we can see everyone again. We've had a number of excellent questions. It seems like the themes for the second part here have been around education and communication, iterative consent, and then using technology and innovation really to improve people's interaction with this information and make it more user-friendly and improve consent and understanding and trust. And so there's a number of questions that came through. I think we're going to start with this one. For the panel, we have about 10 minutes, and so everyone can, if you have a response, feel free to pipe in. In your experience, as you know, as a researcher, what is one aspect of a protocol or even a consent that you have altered that made a significant difference in the enrollment into the study? And anyone can start. Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah, so I think beginning the consenting procedure with friendly language, this is an opportunity for you to consider for your yet to be born child, rather than starting with hard, pharmaceutically driven language. And I believe that makes a significant difference.
I love that. And it's not difficult to do. It's just, again, we don't always think of it. And I also liked, if you wanted to expand a little bit, I liked your comments about the sort of iterative process where you're going back and you're having another conversation and you're asking if there are questions and really building that trust with the family.
Yeah, it's absolutely important. I mean, if we think about our own training in neonatology, it's occurred over years, and you improve your practice, you improve your approaches with an iterative approach to the problem, to the family. And the same should hold true as we consent families for study procedures for diseases that they are maybe entirely unfamiliar with. So it follows that same sort of stream of conversation.
Absolutely. Any other panelists have a comment on any aspect of a protocol that you think that you changed and it made a significant difference? Go ahead, Carl.
Well, no, I think it's not rocket science, but what I usually do is if you ask for consent, take somebody with you, because it's always nice also to post hoc discuss among you two how you have done, because if you're really thinking concept of quality improvement, you have to accept that you can comment on practice of somebody else and the other way around also. And obviously it cannot always be done because we are all busy and 24/7 and whatsoever, but also think in terms of I'll go with you and I will discuss afterwards with you how your consent process has gone. A little bit indeed similar as our clinical practices. When we started, we also had senior colleagues with us to talk with parents, and you, while the younger fellow did the conversation, but afterwards you could comment or reflect on it with the senior one. So why would not do that for clinical research? I mean, it's also skills.
It's fantastic. So I have a couple other questions. Hiroko, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. It sounds like there are opportunities in your hospital and maybe in others as well, where families or patients can learn about clinical research at the very hospital. Can you tell us more about those efforts?
Actually, we have e-learning modules only for like doctors and nurses, for medical professionals. So I think it is really nice if we have some of those learning opportunity or modules for parents or other medical professionals.
That's fantastic, especially if you think about with mothers who are kind of sitting in the hospital waiting to see if they deliver. That's, a somewhat captive audience in terms of learning, although that may be a stressful time as well. But then also after babies are born, they are, in many cases spending a lot of time at the hospital. Mm-hmm. And so having those sort of modules and educational experiences, making sure that they really address the parents at their level and the things that they're interested in, I think could make a big difference.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else? Anything else you wanted to further comment on? I really enjoyed hearing how it's done in your hospital.
Me or?
Yes, you, Hiroko.
Okay. No, that's so taking obtaining, in terms of obtaining consent from parents, like everyone mentioned, that the timing is difficult. So yeah, I agree with Carol, it's nice to have somebody with you and then talk to parents first. And well, usually we only physicians go and then talk to parents to obtain consent, but maybe it's nice to have somebody with you to have some talk first, and then later maybe resident or fellow after that. But maybe it's nice to have like easier talk with somebody who heard those conversations, not the specific doctor to obtain consent.
Right. And I think it was Jennifer earlier who said the best practice is really to not ask for consent on the first time you're meeting the family. I mean, that just makes incredible sense to me. Building that rapport and saying, this is available. I would like you to learn a little bit about it if you're interested. And then we can have a talk at another time. I think that approach is probably more palatable. And also along the same lines as what Victoria was saying with, approaching the language. Language is really important, even though, language is just very important. And then, Gary, this may be a question that you can help us out with. We got a question about the fact that a lot of CROs and study sites just don't have neonatal experience, don't have NICU experience. Are there, and if you don't have an answer, anyone else can step up and answer this one, but how do we improve training at sites that don't necessarily have a dedicated neonatal study coordinator?
Well, what I would say is, the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials, which has been set up in order to improve the way we do trials involving children as well as neonates, would welcome the opportunity to get that kind of expertise involved as early as possible. And I think, bringing a CRO or bringing in another party who's going to contribute to the design or execution of the trial that has minimal or in some instances no expertise in neonatology is a recipe for failure. And that expertise has to be at the table, I think, for a protocol to be designed appropriately as well as executed appropriately. It's not been my experience that there isn't that expertise out there, and that can be expertise that's taken from selected clinical trial sites that have been doing this clinical research for decades. And there are organizations like Barry's CRO, as well as the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials, C4C in Europe, certainly has neonatologists that can be brought to the table to help not only design, again, but think through how to best execute the trials.
So thank you so much for that, Gary. And in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I just saw about 10 more questions that I didn't have the opportunity to see because I needed to scroll down. So I apologize that we haven't addressed them all, and perhaps we can meet in a different forum and talk about some of them. I did get one comment that ongoing and sort of iterative consent could be best done in the electronic format. Obviously, you would like to have human involved and the ability to ask questions to a person and have that connection. But to have electronic resources to refer to and ask, and really be able to learn from, I think is going to be the way of the future. So thank you again for presenting that. Thanks to the panel, thanks to Tamara and the INC folks and the technical team for keeping us on track and going. And I'd like to thank everyone else for attending. We look forward to ongoing discussions. And it sounds like in the platform, there are some ways that we can address some of the questions here. So we'll have an ongoing discussion, and thanks everybody. And I believe there's